they couldn't handle the truth. The moment Caroline Leavitt stepped onto the stage and spoke her mind live on national television, you could feel the tension shift. What was supposed to be another neatly packaged daytime broadcast quickly spiraled into something much more dangerous. Dangerous for the network, for the agenda, and for those invested in maintaining the illusion of consensus. The mainstream media machine thrives on control. Control of the message, control of the tone, and, most importantly, control of the boundaries. But when someone breaks through that carefully constructed shell with raw, unfiltered truth, the system reacts like an exposed nerve. It was instantaneous. There was no room for discussion, no opportunity for counterpoints. Just panic. 1 minute, she's speaking directly to the American people. The next, everything is unraveling. Producers scrambling behind the scenes, co-hosts fidgeting nervously in their chairs, eyebrows raised, voices raised even higher. This wasn't just an off-script moment. This was a breach. Someone said something they weren't supposed to say on a platform that never expected it, and it sent a shockwave through the studio. You could tell they had expected a clash, sure. Conflict. Draws viewers, boosts ratings. But they didn't anticipate a full-blown rupture in the narrative. The media often invites dissenting voices under the illusion of openness, only to trap them in sound bites, scripted debates, or ambushes disguised as interviews. But when Caroline walked onto that stage, she didn't play by their rules. She didn't wait to be prompted. She didn't soften the blow or dilute the message. She went straight for the jugular of the media-industrial complex, and for a few electric minutes, she broke through the noise. And then they shut it down. Think about that. A live broadcast, cut short, not due to technical failure, not due to unforeseen events, but because someone expressed a viewpoint that directly challenged the foundation of what that show represents. That level of immediate censorship speaks volumes about the fragile nature of the narrative they're trying so hard to maintain. They don't fear falsehoods, they fear inconvenient truths. Because falsehoods can be mocked, debated, or dismissed. But the truth has weight. It's sharp. It cuts through distraction and forces people to confront what they've been avoiding. The chaos that followed wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. The machine operates under the premise that people can't be trusted with too much truth. They prefer comfortable illusions, simple dichotomies, and neatly edited talking points. But when someone steps into their arena and speaks without a filter, without pre-approval, without fear, suddenly the script is useless. The media has to rely on control mechanisms, interruptions, outrage, mischaracterizations, or in this case, outright cancellation. And yet, in trying to erase the moment, they amplified it. Cutting the broadcast only confirmed everything that was said. Their reaction exposed the very intolerance they claimed to stand against. The panic, the desperation, the immediate silencing, it all revealed the undercurrent of fear that drives much of today's media culture. It's not about keeping viewers informed, it's about keeping them aligned. Dissent isn't welcome, it's dangerous. That's why this moment was so critical. It pierced the veil. For a fleeting instant, viewers weren't just watching a daytime TV spat. They were witnessing the system malfunction in real time. They saw the mask slip. And whether they agreed or disagreed with what was said, they couldn't unsee the way the media recoiled when confronted with something they didn't control. This wasn't just a guest going rogue. This was a pressure valve being blown open, under the weight of decades of deception, spin, and corporate curation. The people behind the cameras thought they could contain it, that by cutting the feed, issuing statements, or spinning the story later, they could put the genie back in the bottle. But truth doesn't work that way. Once it's out, it lingers. It spreads. It ignites conversations. It raises questions. And it forces people to reevaluate what they thought they knew. And no amount of spin, no matter how polished or rehearsed, can undo that spark. What happened on live television was not just another controversial moment. It was a masterclass in real-time censorship. The sequence unfolded so quickly that many viewers didn't even realize what they were witnessing until it was over. 1 minute, Caroline Leavitt was speaking with clarity and precision, delivering a message that directly challenged the carefully groomed narrative upheld by mainstream platforms. The next, the air was cut, The show abruptly redirected, and a wave of confusion rippled through the audience. This wasn't an accident. This was a calculated shutdown, a visible demonstration of what happens when someone steps too far outside the ideological lines drawn by corporate media. Censorship is no longer cloaked behind subtle edits or post-show press releases. It's brazen now. It happens live in front of the camera, as producers scramble behind the scenes and the hosts scramble for control. What viewers witnessed wasn't just a disagreement or an uncomfortable exchange. It was the media's instinctive reaction to a threat they couldn't predict and couldn't control. The message that was being delivered in that moment struck too close to home. It poked at the unspoken truths that lie beneath the glossy surface of daytime television. That free speech is allowed, but only within a specific, approved framework. The decision to cut away wasn't technical, it was tactical. In an instant, the content was deemed too risky, too volatile, too real. And so, it had to be removed before it gained traction, before it resonated, before it spread. Because the true danger in moments like this isn't what is said, it's what might happen if too many people hear it, think about it, and begin to question everything they've been fed by those very same media institutions. When the segment was yanked, when the cameras stopped rolling on her, the message rang louder than ever. There are boundaries in place, and they are enforced with ruthless efficiency. It's not just about silencing one person, it's about signaling to everyone watching that certain ideas are off limits. The media doesn't just moderate the conversation anymore, they police it. They decide what qualifies as valid speech and what is too controversial, too disruptive, or too challenging to the status quo. That's the genius of live censorship. It disguises itself as a reaction to chaos, a safety measure to preserve decency, when in reality it's a suppression mechanism. And in that moment, it was activated like a reflex. The threat wasn't vulgarity, it wasn't misinformation, it was someone unapologetically telling the truth in a way that couldn't be edited, spun, or softened for public consumption. That kind of honesty is treated like a contagion in tightly controlled media environments. It spreads quickly, infects the narrative, and undermines the power structures that rely on compliance. The conversation that was happening before the cut wasn't filled with personal attacks or inflammatory language. It was simply bold, factual, and outside the bounds of what the producers had likely anticipated. That alone was enough to trigger a full shutdown. Not because they feared for the audience, but because they feared losing control over them. Control is the currency of media today. Control of tone, control of framing, control of how much truth is too much. This wasn't a moment of chaos. It was clarity. For anyone paying attention, the abrupt end to that segment wasn't just censorship. It was an unmistakable signal. It told the public everything they needed to know about who decides what gets aired, what gets suppressed, and how deeply uncomfortable the media becomes when someone refuses to play by their rules. There were no personal attacks involved, no hate speech, no violations of broadcast standards, just an opinion that cut through the noise and struck at the heart of the mainstream illusion. And rather than meet that moment with debate or dialogue, they opted for silence. Not because they didn't have a response, but because they couldn't afford to let the conversation continue. It's a form of narrative triage. Cut the feed, protect the brand, and hope the audience forgets what they saw. But they won't. Because censorship has a boomerang effect. The more visible it is, the more it confirms the suspicion that the system isn't built for open discourse. It's built to maintain a version of reality where only one side gets to speak freely, while the meltdown wasn't just televised, it was historic. In a setting that's normally saturated with carefully choreographed conversations, emotional groupthink, and safe, sanitized takes, what unfolded instead was a spontaneous combustion of the entire format. The usual rhythm was disrupted, the mood shifted, and what had been a predictable exchange quickly turned into something the producers weren't prepared to handle. This wasn't a guest going off script in some minor way. It was a complete break from the expected narrative, and the show unraveled before millions of eyes. From the second Caroline Leavitt challenged the established tone of the panel, the tension began to rise. Not gradually, but like a storm building out of nowhere. At first, there were the usual attempts to steer the conversation, redirect the focus, and restore control. But the words she was delivering had momentum. They didn't come wrapped in diplomatic packaging. They weren't filtered through the usual platitudes. They hit with precision and clarity, and suddenly the facade of tolerance, openness, and diversity of thought that the show so often projects began to crumble. You could see the shift in the room. The hosts, who are normally so confident in their ideological unity, began to lose their footing. Their interruptions became more frequent, their tones more defensive. It wasn't just disagreement, it was discomfort. Because for once, someone wasn't playing along. Someone wasn't there to flatter the format or echo the acceptable talking points. And that kind of pushback doesn't just challenge the discussion, it exposes its artificiality. The co-hosts began raising their voices, not to engage, but to smother, to drown out. That's when the panic set in. When the balance of control slipped from their hands, the show stopped being a talk show and started to look like a power struggle, and the audience could tell. You didn't need to be a political analyst to see the masks slipping. This wasn't about the truth anymore. It was about maintaining dominance, reasserting control, and silencing a voice that wasn't meant to last, beyond the segment. The meltdown wasn't just vocal, it was visible. Shuffling papers, darting eyes, whispered cues coming from behind the cameras. You could practically hear the producers screaming into their headsets, trying to figure out how to cut this off without drawing more attention. But it was too late. The very act of trying to shut it down only highlighted how fragile the operation had become. A single voice, calmly and confidently expressing a dissenting perspective, was enough to send the entire production into crisis mode. And that tells you everything about the current state of mainstream discourse. These platforms aren't built for real conversation. They're built for affirmation. When someone comes along who doesn't need the audience's approval, who doesn't need to be liked or applauded to speak the truth, the system malfunctions. That's why the outburst was so extreme. It wasn't about one comment or one perspective. It was about what that moment represented, a break in the illusion of total consensus. The meltdown didn't just affect the hosts. It hit the network, the viewers, the narrative. For a few minutes, the veil was pulled back, and everyone saw the chaos that ensues when a platform built on control loses its grip. It's a reminder that these shows are not designed to welcome uncomfortable truths. They're designed to manage perception. And when someone rejects that, even momentarily, the panic becomes impossible to contain. It would have been easy for the panel to keep their composure, to engage in civil discussion, and let the moment pass. But they didn't. Because the threat wasn't just in the content of the words, it was in their confidence. It was in the refusal to back down. That kind of energy cuts through any amount of spin, and in an environment where everything is tailored, to appease and pacify, it was like a live wire suddenly sparking in the middle of a press conference. The meltdown was a moment of clarity for viewers. It showed exactly how intolerant the gatekeepers of popular discourse can become when they're confronted with someone who won't play by the script. It was loud, desperate, and telling. The louder the pushback, the more obvious the insecurity behind it. And that, more than any argument or rebuttal, revealed the truth of what that show has become. The broadcast may have been cut, but the message had already taken root. What was meant to be a moment of suppression became a spark, igniting questions and conversations far beyond the studio. That's the irony of modern censorship. Every attempt to silence a voice only amplifies it. And in this case, it was more than just a clash of opinions. It was a flashpoint that revealed something deeper, the growing awareness among ordinary people that they're being managed, not informed. Viewers didn't just witness a disagreement. They saw something that made them pause. The person on that stage wasn't shouting, insulting, or creating chaos. She was speaking directly, confidently, and unapologetically about issues that many feel are being swept under the rug. And that's what made the network nervous. Because when someone speaks, plainly and without fear, it resonates. It doesn't need graphics, fact-checkers, or post-show spin. It sticks. And no matter how fast the showrunners tried to sweep it away, the audience had already heard it. The reaction from the media gatekeepers only confirmed the suspicion that's been growing in millions of minds, that free thought is tolerated only when it aligns with the approved script. The second someone diverges from that, the tone shifts, the smiles fade, and the control mechanisms kick in. But something's changed. More and more people are noticing this pattern. They're watching the reactions more closely than the content. And when they see voices being cut, ideas being shut down, and shows being prematurely ended, they don't see professionalism. They see fear. It's fear of losing the narrative. Fear of independent thought. Fear of a public that's no longer passively absorbing what they're told, but actively thinking for themselves. That's why this moment, brief as it was, carried so much weight. It wasn't just about the content of the speech. It was about the response to it. The immediacy of the cutoff, the scrambling, the awkward transitions. It all pointed to a system that doesn't know how to handle honesty when it comes from outside its bubble. This shift is happening everywhere. Across platforms, across political lines, and across generations. People are waking up not because they're being told to, but because they're starting to recognize the patterns. The media landscape that once felt untouchable is now filled with cracks, and moments like this force the public to confront the uncomfortable truth that those in power are not as confident as they pretend to be. If they were, they wouldn't be so quick to hit the mute button. What this moment did was break the illusion of balance. For too long, the idea has been pushed that every view is welcome, every side gets its time. But that illusion only holds as long as everyone follows the rules. The second someone steps beyond them, the mask slips. And when it does, it confirms what many have long suspected, that certain truths are simply too inconvenient for mainstream platforms to handle. But the message wasn't lost. It found its way through social media, independent outlets, podcasts, and word of mouth. The internet lit up not with outrage, but with curiosity and support. Clips were shared, quotes reposted, commentary poured in. People didn't just want to know what was said. They wanted to understand why it couldn't be said on one of the most visible platforms in the country. That's the real story. Not the interruption, but the impact. Because when you see the system glitch like that, when a show that's run on rails suddenly derails, you start to question how many other voices have been silenced before they ever reached you. And that question leads to more. Who decides what's acceptable? Who's afraid of dissent? What are they trying so hard to protect? This moment didn't just expose the fragility of one show or one network. It exposed the broader fragility of an entire narrative structure that relies on control, not trust. And once people see that, they don't go back to sleep. They start to ask, to dig, to explore. And the more they find, the less power those systems have. That's why, even when the cameras stopped, the real broadcast had only just begun. It moved into living rooms, into group chats, into late-night conversations where people are no longer afraid to say, something's not right. What happened that day wasn't just a media hiccup or a controversial guest segment. It was a revealing moment in the ongoing shift of public awareness. The live shutdown, the abrupt panic, and the visibly shaken hosts didn't just signify a disagreement. They symbolized something much bigger. The collapse of controlled narratives in real time. That kind of reaction doesn't occur when someone is simply mistaken or out of line. It occurs when someone speaks directly to truths that the gatekeepers don't want acknowledged. And the reaction to suppress that voice only validated the message further. People are no longer as passive or unaware as they once were. Every time a voice is silenced, a question is sparked. Every time a conversation is cut short, it fuels curiosity. And with every attempt to shut someone down, the audience gets another glimpse behind the curtain. These moments are no longer isolated incidents. They're part of a broader awakening, a collective recognition that what's being presented on major platforms isn't the full picture. The old model of controlled discussion, where only select viewpoints are allowed and any dissent is met, with immediate shutdown, is no longer effective. The audience is evolving faster than the platforms can keep up. This is why the moment matters. It's not just about one guest, one show, or one controversial statement. It's about the power of speech that isn't pre-approved. It's about the courage to say what others are thinking, but afraid to voice. And it's about how quickly those in charge will act when that courage gets too close to disrupting the comfort of curated narratives. Censorship no longer goes unnoticed. It backfires. It draws more attention to the very ideas it tries to suppress. And as more people start to see this happen again and again, they begin to realize that real dialogue doesn't happen on shows where dissent is cut off at the source. Real dialogue happens when people are allowed to think critically, challenge authority, and speak without fear of being silenced mid-sentence. In the end, the show may have ended that day, but the story didn't. The message carried on, shared, discussed, debated, and magnified. And that's the most powerful part. You can cut the feed, you can stop the cameras, but you can't control the ripple effect. Once truth enters the public space, it spreads, whether the networks approve of it or not. That's the era we're entering now, one where people are no longer waiting for permission to question what they're told. They're doing it on their own, and they're doing it